please stop labeling people as narcissists. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming back. For those of you who don't know, my name is Mickey and I'm a therapist. And we talk about therapy stuff on this channel because I just never shut up about mental health. We are talking about the Gabbie Hanna situation, not because I want to drag anybody, but because there is a lot of mental health stuff that's come up. I really wanted to avoid this. I wanted to avoid talking about this because honestly, the YouTube drama is exhausting to me. But the more information that's come out about this, the more that I'm like, okay, like there's a lot of mental health related things here that I think are important to host a conversation around. Before we get started, I want to issue a caveat. I do not have all of the facts about the Gabbie Hanna situation. I don't know everything because the whole thing just seems like very he said, she said, and like whatever. I mostly want to talk about this because I think there's a lot of useful discourse to have around this topic of abuse and narcissism and trauma and gaslighting and all that stuff. So I wanted to talk about it from my perspective as a mental health professional. And again, just to be clear, we can't diagnose people over the internet. I am not trying to diagnose anybody. This channel is not intended to be therapy, a replacement for therapy. I'm only here to talk about education, entertainment, all of that stuff. So let's just jump into it. If you're not aware of the situation, I would encourage you to go watch like a recap video because there's just like way too much for me to recap. This is just to talk about generally this theme that seems to have come up a lot around the idea of trauma and abuse and narcissism. This is something that I have noticed happening in the last couple of years as mental health has become a more common topic of conversation, especially among people who are like millennial and Gen Z, which is great and I think very useful. I'm always excited to see people talking about mental health. However, there seems to be some misunderstanding for how some of the terms are being used and like what they actually mean. So we're here to do basically some myth busting about it. The first term that I want to talk about is narcissism. I see people use this a lot and like this comes up on Instagram and Pinterest a lot. These like how to spot a narcissist things and like please don't. The clinical presentation for narcissistic personality disorder is something that only a mental health professional can diagnose. And honestly, I would say not all mental health professionals are created equal here. Like I personally would not diagnose somebody with narcissistic personality disorder because I don't have the necessary experience with cluster B personality disorders to really fully understand what I'm looking at. If I were presented with someone who seemed to meet the criteria for that, I would refer them out or I would ask for consultation or I would reach out to somebody who is more experienced than me or an expert in that field in order to get the necessary context and in order to have the necessary expertise to make that diagnosis. Personality disorders are very misunderstood. Even within the mental health community, there are a lot of therapists who say, I don't want to work with cluster B. For those of you who don't know, cluster B personality disorders in the DSM are delineated into different groups. There's lots of different personality disorders, but cluster B are the ones that are typically stigmatized the most and that people refer to as like the bad ones. This includes narcissistic personality disorder, but can also be antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder. What is the other one that I'm thinking of? Borderline. Oh my God. Feels like popping a pimple when that happens. So yeah, cluster B personality disorders are the ones that are typically stigmatized the most, especially by mental health professionals. There are therapists and clinicians who say that they don't want to work with these people. We sort of treat people with cluster B personality disorders as if they are unhinged and awful and terrible. And there's also this trope of like being a serial killer and like the whole thing. But again, there's a lot of stigma around that already. And so, like I said, I think it's important to talk about this, from like the destigmatization point of view, but also because there's a lot of misunderstanding with this. Not all, like I said already, not all mental health professionals are created equal. And even they don't all have, myself included, don't all have the necessary experience and credentials to appropriately treat people and appropriately diagnose these. So I really want to caution you, if you're not a mental health professional who specifically specializes in personality disorders, please refrain from diagnosing people or labeling people with these disorders because A, it's not appropriate for us to diagnose people that we don't know, even if you are the appropriate party to do so. But B, because when we do that, we're contributing to this overall stigmatization of personality disorders and diluting the actual meaning of that. Personality disorders and narcissism in particular is like there's a lot of criteria to meet in order to be diagnosed with that. The way that the DSM works is someone has to have at least 7 of these 9 in this particular time frame, in this kind of presentation, like there's just a lot of boxes that you have to check here. So it is frustrating to see someone like Gabbie Hanna with such a large platform labeling people as narcissists, and especially saying that's narcissistic abuse about actions that, you know, may have been very hurtful to her. But again, she doesn't have the credentials to be diagnosing someone. And even if she did, she's not the therapist in that equation. So you can't be diagnosing strangers anyways. I also think there's a conversation to be had about the term narcissism in general. I've seen a lot of people say like, oh, they're a narcissist. And like, again, you don't know that. And even if you did, you're not the therapist, so don't say that. But there is a difference between someone being a clinical narcissist and someone being like self-centered or selfish. And I think it's totally fair to label people's behavior sometimes as being self-centered or being selfish. That very much happens. And sometimes it is okay or appropriate to call people out with kindness and respect and compassion that their behavior is being self-centered or not being considerate to others. That's totally fair. But if that's the case, please label them as self-centered or selfish or any of the other synonyms that we could use that aren't the word narcissist. There is also a lot of talk going on about narcissistic abuse, which is a very specific type of abuse that has to come from someone who is a diagnosed clinical narcissist. And again, I just, want to caution you guys to not label things in that way if you don't know for 100% certain that that's what it is, because again, we're contributing to stigma. We are diluting the meaning of that term and like really sort of getting lost in the trees there, or lost in the weeds, or whatever the fucking phrase is. The word gaslighting, this is another one that has like really blown up in the last couple of months or maybe years. People using the term gaslighting to describe things that are not gaslighting. I'm going to read you the actual definition for gaslighting because I'm sure that someone can summarize it more succinctly than I can. To manipulate someone by psychological means into questioning their own sanity or reality. Basically what this means is that if I am holding up a pencil and someone says, hey, nice pencil, and I say, this isn't a pencil, this is a pen. And they go, no, that's a pencil. No, it's a pen. And you keep feeding this person this rhetoric and you make them feel like, am I crazy? What are you talking about? Like, of course that's a pencil. And someone like is so committed to this rhetoric that they abuse you in such a way to upset or to influence your perception of reality and to make you question your own ability to understand even the most basic, right in front of you kind of reality stuff. This is a very common tactic by abusers who will say like, oh, that never happened. I don't know what you're talking about. That didn't happen. That kind of a thing. So gaslighting is not when we tell someone that they're behaving inappropriately. Gaslighting is not telling someone that they are mean or rude or, when we insult someone. That's not gaslighting. Gaslighting is this very calculated and intentional attempt to manipulate someone's ability to trust themselves and to perceive reality. Gaslighting often happens in relationships with people who know one another. Typically, we see this happen in romantic relationships or in familial relationships. This rarely occurs between one influencer and another influencer. So like, I struggle when people use this term gaslighting, especially when Gabbie Hanna uses this term gaslighting to describe someone who critically reviewed her poetry as gaslighting her. Please, again, I want to encourage you to use the appropriate terminology when we're talking about things, because if, Gabbie Hanna is upset about Rachel Oates criticizing her poetry, she can say that. She can say, I think you're unintelligent, or I think that you're wrong, or I don't like that, or that hurt my feelings. That's all totally valid. That's fair. You are allowed to feel how you feel, and you are allowed to have the opinion that you have. But when we start to use terms like gaslighting and abuse and narcissism and like sort of muddy the waters with that, A, you're not getting your point across appropriately, and B, these are terms that were invented for use in mental health and clinical environments, and it's not ideal for us to be just sort of throwing them around willy-nilly. Again, the reason that I wanted to talk about this is not because I am interested in like starting a fight with Gabbie Hanna, but because I think this is a good learning opportunity for you guys who watch this channel to sort of learn about the different terms and terminology that exists in mental health about abuse, about narcissism, and all of that stuff. I really want to encourage you guys to hold yourselves to this higher standard of not using language that isn't accurate and not intentionally labeling people as something that's really damaging just to try and prove a point. I also think that there is something to be said. We talked about this with the James Charles video, but I also wanted to talk about the abuse of power that's happening here, and it seems pretty clear clear at this point, or at least from my understanding, like Gabbie Hanna is leveraging her fan base to inflict fear and to make people feel hurt or upset. She's sort of dispatching the people who like her to go and leave hate comments or say mean things or dislike things or whatever. And that is a very clear abuse of power. That's very inappropriate. And again, it's really important for influencers to be aware of the platform that they have and how that can impact people's lives. And so, not that this is necessarily applicable to all of you, because I'm doubtful that all of you have your own individual, giant YouTube channels, but still, be mindful of that. And I think it is useful to acknowledge power imbalances in whatever way that they exist, even if that's in a parent and child interaction, if that's in a romantic partnership context, whatever that looks like. I want to encourage you guys to be mindful of how power imbalances affect the way that we interact with one another and how that can change the impact of your actions. Because for one person to tell another person, you're a bitch, okay, that's hurtful for sure. But for someone with a platform as large as Gabbie Hanna's to leverage that kind of hate at another person, there's like different fallout from that. So yeah, I guess this whole thing is just to say, be mindful and be conscientious in the language and the terminology that you're using. And please stop labeling people as narcissists. If you guys have questions, comments, or concerns, please put them in the comments because I'd love to chat with you about it. I know that this is kind of like an ongoing issue that Gabbie Hanna has had with being inappropriate on the internet. So I'd love to know what your guys' thoughts and feelings about the whole thing are. But yeah, like the video if you like the video, subscribe to the channel because we do stuff like this and therapist react style stuff and fun stuff here. So I'd love to have you stay. Share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow. And I will see you guys next Saturday. Okay, bye.